Coalition, which is a member organization of the Hands Off Syria Coalition, and that's the website for the Hands Off Syria Coalition. There's some leaflets, there's some literature over there on Syria and other things, including the statement of the Hands Off Syria Coalition, which was kind of like our founding document of what we stand for. I'm also on the coordinating committee of the Hands Off Syria Coalition. We have 4 panelists today. I'll introduce them more fully as I introduce each one to speak. But we have Tarek Kauf from Veterans for Peace. We have Sarah Flounders from the International Action Center. Judy Bello from Syria Solidarity Movement. And Bayman Azad from the U.S. Peace Council. So we're going to start with Tarek. And Tarek Kauf was a U.S. Army paratrooper for 3.5 years. He's on the Veterans for Peace National Board of Directors. He led veterans delegations to Ferguson, Missouri, Standing Rock, North Dakota, Jeju Island in South Korea, Okinawa, and Palestine. And he is the managing editor of the Peace in Our Times, which is the Veterans for Peace quarterly newspaper, and there's copies of it over there. So let's start with Tarek.
Good morning, and thanks for coming out. Basically, I'd just like to repeat Veterans for Peace's position on what's going on in Syria. First of all, we're aware that the United States has been, for its entire history, the greatest purveyor of terrorism and war and violence, probably in the history of the world. I actually can't think of any other country that has promoted so much violence and been involved in creating so much violence. And we're aware that what's happening in Syria is part of the mess in the Middle East that colonial powers caused years ago, and that the United States has been deeply involved in. We're also aware that the CIA is very, very powerfully involved in what's going on in Syria. We're aware that we're arming so-called rebel groups, so-called moderate groups, which the moderates, the non-violent people among them, have long since disowned because they've been taken over by violence and violent groups who are waging, war in Syria. Many of these groups are using American-made weapons. We've been bombing Syria for a while, and we're just contributing to the chaos and the misery and the death and destruction that's going on there. So Veterans for Peace is totally opposed to U.S. involvement in that area, except in diplomatic terms. We are demanding that the current idiot in the White House withdraw troops. We have troops in Syria now. We have planes. Withdraw all of our military forces and back out of Syria and engage in diplomacy. We also insist that, let me just say, we're not taking a position one way or the other on whether Bashar Assad's government is good or bad. That's not our business. That's the business of the Syrian people. Meanwhile, it's one of the only secular governments in that area. And we urge our government to recognize that government and deal with them diplomatically. We don't feel that the use of force or violence has or will solve anything. So our position as Veterans for Peace is get the hell out of there. Stop bullshitting the public. Stop trying to convince the public that we are dealing with some horrific agents that we have to stop, that we have no alternative to stopping. People are seeing through that, and we hope that people continue to see through that lie, because it is very similar to many lies that this country has used to excuse wars of terror that it has waged. So as veterans who have participated in the military, sometimes in wars of aggression, we are totally opposed to this. We want peace, we want diplomacy, we want respect for elected governments, and we do not want to interfere in that conflict over there, regardless of the propaganda that comes out of the government, and regardless of whether Bashar al-Assad is a nice guy or not a nice guy. Regardless of that, American involvement only makes the situation worse, period, and always has. So that's Veterans for Peace's position.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Judith Bellow. Judith is a member of the UNAC Administrative Committee. She's representing the Syria Solidarity Movement on the panel. She's a founding member of the Upstate New York Drone Action, which has done some incredible actions, especially at the Hancock Drone Base, which Judy has been involved in. She's visited Syria, I think, on 2 occasions, and she has also visited a number of other countries on peace delegations. This is Judy.
Hi. I wanted to talk a little about some of the myths that the United States uses to manipulate people into supporting this heinous war against the people of Syria. I visited Syria twice. I was an election observer in 2014, and in that particular occasion, I talked to a lot of ordinary people. I spent some time in Tartus, going to different election places and talking to people there. And I had a translator they delegated to me so I could actually freely talk to people. And at the time, one thing that was clear was that people in general really wanted to keep Bashar Assad as their president. For them, he represents security and a future for the country, a stable future on which they can build. So we also had people at that time who went to Sueda and Homs, and they had the same feedback. And in fact, in Beirut, so many Syrian refugees converged to vote in Beirut that they literally shut the city down. So this was really an important, I think, pivotal moment. So to get to the myths, the first is that the Syrian war is a sectarian war. Well, inside Syria, it's not a sectarian war. The fact that Assad is an Alawite and nearly 80% of Sunnis are Muslim, Muslims are Sunni, is more or less irrelevant in this context. Syria's been home to numerous Christian and Muslim splinter groups since the time of Christ. Because those religions had early founding moments there, Christ was born in part of Greater Syria, and the second caliphate was also in Damascus, and all these little fragments of these religions grew up there and stayed, and they're still there. And it's a very stable, ancient, multi-faith fabric in Syria. Journalists who visited there are really amazed, and in like the 2006 or 8 period, a woman named Jean Marie Offenbacher made a film called Tea on the Axis of Evil, where she interviewed all these Syrians about just the fact that they were happy living together and they don't talk about religion in any major way, the same as we don't here. So I thought that was very interesting. This last time I was in Syria, I visited the Grand Mufti. The Grand Mufti, all Sunni, largely Sunni countries have a Grand Mufti, and he's sort of the endowed person there who can make legal judgments within the Islamic faith. And the current Grand Mufti of Syria, Hassan Badreddin Hassoun, says that he thinks that all religions should be able to coexist in peace under a secular government, and that way the religious communities can focus on what's important, which is their faith. The government of Bashar al-Assad is not an Alawite government. It reflects the demographics of the country, as does the Syrian Arab Army at this point. It's very much just conscripts coming from all over the country. And people at this point are volunteering to protect their country. The next myth I want to address is the Syrian people rose up against oppression. Syria is a socialist republic. It has in its constitution a mandate to provide for the needs of the people. Government provides free education and medical care, water, electricity, an economic safety net for the poor, including general subsidies for bread and gasoline. The women in Syria have many rights. They're many of them are well educated. There's no political constraints on their activities. There are conservative religious communities in Syria, like there are in this country, that constrain the way women can live. But that is a different element than whether or not it's politically constrained. So you often will see a woman in a hijab and a long dress walking down the street in conversation with a woman in Western style clothes and her hair flowing down her back. It's very common because they don't judge it. It's just the way it is. The next myth I want to address briefly is that Assad is a ruthless dictator and the Syrian people hate him. In fact, when he came to power, he was very, very popular. He was unanimously supported by the parliament and had a large majority of the people supporting him as well. In inheriting Syria, Bashar's trial by fire, Flint Leverett lists all his actions in the first couple of years of his coming in control of the country. And basically, he freed a gazillion prisoners. He freed a lot of prisoners that nobody knew what had happened to them. Many of them were from the Muslim Brotherhood, a sort of longtime enemy of the Ba'ath Party. He opened up the universities and he brought in high-tech stuff into the universities and subjects in computer science, internet. He allowed a free press to begin, and a number of periodicals started to arise that were not controlled by the Ba'ath Party. In 2011, while there were opposition rallies that we saw on TV here, in Syria there were also much larger rallies in support of the Syrian government, which I might add that although they support Bashar al-Assad, he is not the whole Syrian government. They have a robust bureaucratic government, as much as I've seen anywhere here or in Europe. They have all kinds of people doing all kinds of jobs in that government that are just, supporting the people. In 2012, Bashar al-Assad met with dissidents from around the country, and anyone who would meet with him, basically. They had the Constitution rewritten to reflect the concerns of the people who were willing to talk to him. And he brought in Ali Haidar, the leader of a longtime left opposition party, into the government as Minister of Reconciliation, and began creating the groundwork for the reconciliation committees they're using now. And reconciliation, it is a hard thing in the middle of a knockdown, drag-out war, because they have to draw the people off who don't want to fight anymore from those who will, who are foreigners or who will fight to the death for whatever they're thinking about. So there's no reason, though, to think that in 2014, Assad was elected by a great majority, as I talked about when I introduced myself. He was very popular because the people want their country back. Another thing that I need to mention is that 2/3 of the Syrian people are still in the government-held areas, including the great majority of the refugees. So everyone wants the protection of having a government. And Assad is more or less the symbol of that government, because this war is a war that's attacking civilization in Syria. So another myth I want to get to quickly is that the war began with peaceful protests. In Daraa, where the war infamously began with a civilian massacre, we're told, it was later noted that more police and soldiers were killed than civilians. A huge stockpile of weapons was found in the central mosque there, and it was guarded by foreign jihadis who had come up from Libya through Jordan. In a town, a border town with Turkey called Jisr al-Shugur, Islamist fighters trained in Turkey, sent their families over to a camp where I might add they still live across the border in Turkey. And they called for help to the Syrian military, and they, when the soldiers arrived, they killed them all. And what's happening now in Jisr al-Shugur is that it's physically in ruins, and it's inhabited by 200,000 Asian jihadis and their families from Uyghurs and people really from the Far East, and who are looking for a place where they can have an Islamist community, which isn't really welcome in China. No one I met in Syria thought there were moderate rebels. Everyone had a horror story to tell about someone they loved being killed, being threatened, just horror stories that I can't even begin to tell you. People having their food, being denied food and medical access, children being shot in the street for laughing at a bad joke, just women being stripped and flogged in public for not having a hijab on. Just horrific stories that went on. And the one I'm going to repeat to you is Edward Dark, a correspondent from Aleppo, who initially supported the revolution, changed his mind when the jihadis got there in 2013, because they came into the town and they started, besides all the things that I just listed, and being ruthlessly killing Christians and Alawites in the street and so on, they also, they went into the most prosperous district in all of Syria, where all of the factories are and where a lot of the wealth of the country comes from. They dismantled the factories and they shipped all the machinery up to Turkey. And then they burned the buildings and smashed them and bombed them. So they destroyed the one source of wealth in the country. And one of the things that was there actually was the last chlorine factory in Syria, which might throw some light on. All of a sudden there are all these chemical attacks with chlorine. So I don't overrun my time here, the last thing I want to talk about is the myth that the U.S. isn't, we're just observing this. We're not really doing this. Shortly after Bashar Assad came to power, George Bush placed Syria on the axis of evil and implemented severe sanctions against Syria, economic sanctions. In 2008, it was documented they were looking for ways to create more dissidents in Syria. In 2010, Ambassador Ford went to Syria and started meeting with all kinds of revolutionaries, including primarily the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a very right-wing religious organization. The U.S. and U.S. allies have supplied weapons and training and political support consistently to militant mercenaries and terrorists in Syria. And they have supplied tons and tons of cash through our allies. Meanwhile, they're enforcing draconian sanctions on the government and the people who actually live in Syria and want to keep their lives. The United States, with Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, have waged a relentless propaganda war against the Syrian government through international satellite TV stations, and that impresses the people in Syria as well as outside of Syria, because they hear all these rumors. They hear there's a war on, they hear that democracy and freedom are suddenly going to get better. They hear all kinds of craziness. So while the Western press is screaming Assad must go and the barrel bomb murderer, the Arabic language channels are calling for genocide against Alawites and Christians coming out of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. So onto the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood has many immigrants in the U.S., which form the nucleus of the Syrian National Council. These people came here after a violent insurrection in Syria in the 80s that failed. They killed all of the officials in the city of Hama and took over. And so the Syrian army went in a sort of infamous moment and took the city back, also using violence. But at any rate, they came here and they've been waiting. And they are not interested in democracy and freedom, though. This war is about power. It's about power for the Muslim Brotherhood, power for Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They want a right-wing theocratic state governed by laws that were new 1,500 years ago, and men who want power now. Recently, these men have been replaced, first by the most rapacious militias operating in concert with Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. They're going to the meetings, and they're being put forward as future rulers of Syria, kind of like the militants in Libya right now, who are at each other's throats. The U.S. has made promises all around. The statement, "Assad must go," is a promise that the U.S. will ensure the ultimate success of this war to undermine the Syrian Republic and destroy the infrastructure of that state. Recent moves by the U.S. to directly occupy parts of eastern Syria with a Kurdish army are evidence that the U.S. is continuing to move forward with this plan, and that they don't change their plans ever, they only change their proxies. So what they have in eastern Syria is a mixture of ISIS and Kurds, through which they hope to govern an occupied territory.
Thank you.
State.
Our next speaker is Bachman Aziz. He is on the Executive Board and Organizational Secretary of the U.S. Peace Council. He's the NGO representative to the United Nations from the World Peace Council. He's chair of the Iran Working Group of Veterans for Peace. He's a professor of economics and sociology, and he's on the coordinating committee of the Hands Off Syria Coalition.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you all for coming and making it possible. I would like to divert a little bit from Syria. I think Judy gave you a full picture of what is going on inside and what the agents and activists or actors are on both sides. I want to go a step further beyond that and put it in a context, a broader context. The question is, what is the root cause of this whole tragedy that is going on? And it is not just in Syria. We have seen it in very many different places. And the problem is that our movement, our peace movement, a great part of it, not all of them, of course, not us, have been reactive. They wait until the war starts and they try to protest without analyzing what is the cause so that they can be preemptive before the next one starts. And the reason for that, in our understanding, in the Peace Council's understanding, is that the U.S. imperialism, and I will use that word although many people hesitate to do that, I think it's important to understand it. It's a key concept in this, that we are not dealing with different administrations, different policies. We are not dealing with different countries, different cases. We are not dealing with different evil leaders all over the place, each one separate from each other. We have been reacting to case by case by case. And the whole thing started, I would say, after the dismantling of the USSR, and the drive that started on the part of Western imperialism to take the full control of the globe, especially take over the parts of the globe that was under the influence of the Soviet Union. And that triggered a process that was pretty much formulated by people in the Project for the New American Century in the early 1990s, 94 actually, they put out the document. And these people became later on members of the Bush administration and implemented policy, which was based on a document, 90-page document. It's online, you can look at it, Project for the American Century, and look for the rebuilding America's defenses for the 21st century, for the current century. And they outline over there in that document exactly what has been going on. That is before 2000. Exactly what has been going on ever since. And I want to go over some of these terms before I get to my discussion about what I'm focusing on. I'm quoting here. I have extracted a few paragraphs out of the 90-page document. It starts by saying that the United States must shape a new century favorable to American interests. That's the assumption. At present, the United States forces faces no global rival. Therefore, there are, however, potentially powerful states dissatisfied with the current situation and eager to change it. Our defense strategy must be maintaining U.S. preeminence, precluding the rise of a great power rival. And we know they specifically mention China as that emerging rival. Today, the military's task is to expand the zone of democratic peace, military expanding the zone of democratic peace, to deter the rise of a new great power competitor. On the basis of that, they advocate the dispatching of concentrating U.S. naval forces around China, East Asia. And they are starting doing that. They have done that already. It is, another side of it, it is important that NATO not be replaced by European Union, leaving United States without a voice in the European security affairs, which involves this whole new Ukraine issue and everything else that was another source of conflict. It is now commonly understood that there are forces that may threaten America's ability to exercise its dominant military power. Potential rivals such as China are anxious to exploit the situation, while adversaries like Iran, Iraq, and North Korea are rushing to develop ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons as a deterrent to American intervention in the region. They are not being aggressive. They themselves concede that these are defensive mechanisms being created to deter U.S. from intervention. Okay? If an American peace is to be maintained and expanded, it must have a secure foundation on unquestioned U.S. military preeminence. Okay? Then they go on to list some of these countries that are really in the crosshairs for putting them down or dividing them or subduing them, and they mention North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. And if you remember, Wesley Clark, the former member, head of NATO, commander of NATO, mentioned several countries that were on the list. These are the objectives. That is for total domination and U.S. hegemony over the whole globe. And this is why it's going on. But the way they present it, they have put it in the context of a humanitarian imperialist strategy, that they are going there to save people from dictators, from violations of human rights, to support women and liberate women as they did in Afghanistan, and all kind of causes like this. And who are the people who are doing this to these innocent people? Are these demonic leaders? So if you go through the whole situation since the collapse of the Soviet Union up to the present, you will see that each one of them will justify the invasions, attacks, military interference were all justified in the name of an evil or bad dictator or a bad guy. Yugoslavia, Milosevic; Panama, Noriega; Afghanistan, the Taliban; Iran, the Ayatollah; Iraq, Saddam Hussein; Libya, Gaddafi; Syria, Assad; Venezuela, Chavez, and now Maduro; Ukraine, Yanukovych; Russia, Putin now, right? Demonization is going on and on. And this is always the main justification for implementing this general strategy, that is the total domination, and stopping any rival from emerging after the Soviet Union was gone. Now, there's two parts to this whole demonization strategy. One is to distract people and present it as something good, right? When you invade another country in the name of bringing down a kind of a brutal dictator, you look good. So it doesn't become an issue for the public. That demonization also pacifies the peaceful. Because we have heard in Syria, when we've been opposing Syrian intervention, many of the even very prominent peace organizations in the US are talking about both sides are bad, we cannot take sides. That is because because that whole imperialist context is missing. They look at each case individually, and they are taken by the propaganda, demonization propaganda, that it was in 1975 when I was a student, and Mike Wallace in a 60-minute program at that time mentioned that we can create enemy number one of any country's leader in 2 weeks. We have reached that level of media technology that we can do. Before we invaded Iraq, many people didn't know where Iraq was. We didn't know who Saddam Hussein was, right? And many of these leaders, a month or 2 months prior to the attack, people didn't know who they were, right? But in 2 months, they are the enemy number one, depending on who's on the agenda, right? So what they do, they pacify through this, the peace movement. We have heard this about Syria more commonly. Both sides are bad. Assad is brutal, and we don't support the State Department, so we're sitting on the fence doing nothing. That's one side of it. The second side is probably more sinister, and that is this demonization is actually masking the fact that all these attacks are linked, part and parcel of the same imperialist strategy. By focusing on the leader as if it's just this particular leader the cause of this invasion, that particular leader as the cause of the other invasion, right? They distract people from the scheme that is guiding and driving the whole thing. And they are taking them one by one and according to a given plan that they themselves have already outlined. And this has been going on, and this is what is going on. Okay. And I think this is what a great weakness in our peace movement, that it does not recognize the imperialist context of this that is going on. And they are going against aggression, but not against imperialism. Because when you go against aggression, they are dealing with each case of aggression separately, right? Unless you see that it's done for the same purpose everywhere. And it's the same force, with the same intentions that they're doing. So we should really focus on bringing the whole anti-imperialist orientation to our peace movement. Because unless we do that, we will not be able to counter what is going on and prevent the future ones that are coming. And we think they are coming. And they are getting involved in Venezuela right now. They're trying to bring that up. And that was my 2 cents about this.
Good 2 cents. Thank you. Our last but not least speaker is Sarah Flounders. Sarah is the coordinator of the International Action Center. She's a member of the Administrative Committee of the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. She's a member of the Coordinating Committee of the Hands Off Syria Coalition. She has been on a number of trips to Syria. She's the author of several books and pamphlets. Sarah.
Thanks so much, and I'm really glad to participate in this program today, this panel of Hands Off Syria. As Joe said, I've traveled to Syria in delegations to bring others, to report back, to make videos during the war. And in an earlier time when there were major international Palestine conferences in Syria, you could see a very different view of what Syria was as a modern secular state, so much linked to the region and to the world. So before 2011, you would have seen a totally different and secular progressive state than what you see today, where a third of the population are displaced, are refugees. And yet, overwhelmingly, it is the government in Syria that is providing for people. Every single school, every community building, a room like this classroom will house a family or 2 families. And yet, there aren't homeless people in the streets, with a third of the population displaced. So you see 2 very different views of Syria. And I want to say the importance, to pick up on points that Tarek and Judy made, of international delegations. helped to organize delegations in Palestine or Iraq, Iran, Colombia, South Korea, is to take a group of people from different directions to see a country and report back to their milieus, to their both church and political groups and schools. It's a very important part of building and sustaining a movement against U.S. wars. Now, it always raises the question of how does the anti-war movement respond in a period of endless U.S. wars? I mean, this is a problem, because to oppose U.S. wars, you have to explain them in the most concrete ways. At the same time, you have to know that the corporate media won't give you a line of coverage. Their role is to support every one of these wars and do so through constant confusion and obfuscation, just piling it on with demonization and horror stories. It's also a different period than earlier, let's say, thinking back to the Vietnam War, where there was a big divide even within the U.S. ruling class, within U.S. power. And part of their fighting it out was to give great publicity to the movement, because a strong part of them felt the war was unwinnable. And in fact, that was true, given the level of resistance of the Vietnamese people. But today, this is a period of, in the U.S. empire, of complete rot and decay. None of their wars are succeeding. They say it's a unipolar world. They're the only power. They decide. And yet, here we are, 16 years into a war in Afghanistan, the longest war, with no end in sight. They received none of the gains they thought were a sure thing in Iraq or in Libya, and they have been completely unsuccessful so far in Syria. And so we want to address a great deal of that war today. But we know that U.S. wars create massive destruction, both against a targeted country and in the entire region. And that needs to be addressed also. So it's a different period where the U.S. empire, what do they have to offer any country in the world? Weapons sales. That's it, really. How many billions of dollars will Saudi Arabia buy? $350 billion in weapons over the next 10 years? Will it reach $1 trillion? I mean, really, it's quite incredible. They can offer also U.S. bases. And they can offer massive destruction, assassinations, coups, sabotage, interference in the elections of every country, while screaming about that there's interference here. So they have nothing to offer, and this is a real problem for the U.S. empire. They also have nothing to offer here, except an assurance that everything from Social Security and pensions and health care and schools will be cut further and further to sustain these wars. So we're in a period where we have to address all the wars and yet address and give information on each of the wars. But the anti-war movement now does need a view of U.S. imperialism, of the U.S. empire, and the empire in this period, a different period. They are contracting. In economic terms, a second-rate power with a first-rate nuclear weapons, a military machine larger than the whole world combined, and a constant threat to use it. They sail their aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, hold war games off the coast from Korea and China to the very borders of Ukraine. So the Hands Off Syria coalition was an effort to take this enormous manufactured confusion, because it doesn't happen accidentally, and hammer out a statement, a unified statement, and pull out a few facts that were so obvious. We passed this out earlier, this Hands Off Syria statement that's available online, but it has thousands of signers around the world, and organizational signers. It helped to generate a debate in many, many organizations. Would they sign this? What did it mean? Were they in agreement? And have a basic agreement on a few facts on Syria and a few demands on Syria. And actually, it's a very good template for other building opposition to other U.S. wars. So I want to raise it from that perspective, because sometimes we have to think how we handle both the concrete and have a wider view of what we're about, and how we go about building unity among many different forces. So, as I say, we hammered out a few facts that were so obvious that this is a U.S. orchestrated intervention. That was number one. That it's a U.S. demand of regime change. The government must resign. That the sanctions have destabilized not only Syria, but the entire region. It puts the whole region in a complete lockdown, creating enormous hardship. Another obvious fact, guaranteed even in the UN Charter, the government of Syria has a right to call on other countries and forces for assistance against an outside intervention. And maybe most important, it's so obvious, but it's not our business to decide the government of Syria, to decide for or against Assad. I mean, imagine saying that to the movement at large. This is the business of the people of Syria. Now, there can be different views on the government, to praise it, in opposition, to feel it could go further, do more, do less, and even on this panel, and within the signers of Hands Off Syria. But we all agree on one point: it's not our business. It's the business of the people of Syria. So that was sort of the basic points of unity that we came up with. And then we came up with 4 basic demands. End regime change. End all foreign aggression and the arming and the funding. End all the military and financial and logistical intervention. And end the sanctions. And then to also say the most obvious, that we need jobs and health care and education and an end to racist police here in the U.S. and not wars and violence abroad. So that was the basis of the Hands Off Syria statement. But as I say, this could be a template for other struggles. Hands off Venezuela. Hands off the Ukraine. NATO out. Hands off Cuba and the blockade. And we could go on and on. Now, I also want to salute the many different kinds of actions, because very often those who are for the war or don't want to be pushed to take a stand say, well, there just aren't enough people in the streets. You haven't done enough to capture my attention. My time is almost up, so let me sort of end on these points. That in the past 6 years, in terms of the war in Syria, earlier the war in Libya, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, not only delegations organized, but constantly forums, videos, meetings, coordinated forums across the country, coordinated demonstrations again and again. Sometimes we say, well, we think we can pull this off in 25 cities where there will be at least a picket line. Other times we've had up to 100 cities where there is a coordinated action. When the U.S. Congress was actually going to vote on U.S. intervention, if you remember, it was at 2014 or 2015, there were militant delegations that went to every single congressional office in the country and said, no, don't you dare. Now, every one of these coordinated actions show what's possible. Final point is that we're up against, and have been from the very beginning, an enormous number of funded non-governmental organizations and media, including what's called alternative media, whose role is simply to sow confusion, distrust, and to give the soft line of the U.S. State Department. And this is true whether we're talking about Amnesty International reports, Human Rights Watch, Democracy Now!, the Bernie Sanders campaign, whether it's Republican or Democrat, it's Trump, Clinton, or Sanders, they all agree that the U.S. war in Syria was entirely legitimate. And anyone who didn't agree was somehow out of touch with reality. So we're up against a lot, even right here at Left Forum, where overwhelmingly there can be forces who are absolutely for the war and for giving every possible reason and excuse. So we have an alliance, the U.S. has an alliance of the most reactionary forces, and they're also backed up by all those who say resistance is impossible. And we have to really band together in new ways, find constant ways, and this one campaign, the Hands Off Syria campaign, was a way of impacting many organizations. I would encourage everyone here to go to the website of Hands Off Syria Coalition, sign that, send it out to others, and see if it can be the basis of having united kinds of actions, and actions which educate people on what the U.S. empire is today, in this period of extreme decline and yet extreme ruthlessness, that our strength and our unity, our solidarity with people who are under attack around the world, we can be a material force if we understand what we're about, and we do so, and we act in a very conscious way.
One point of information.
Point of information.
I would like to also add to Sarah's information that the coalition fully supports Tulsi Gabbard's from Hawaii is her bill at the Congress, HR 608, which is calling for cutting all support by the U.S. government for all terrorists everywhere, including Syria. We have been trying to mobilize in support of that bill. There is a website, hr608.info, where people can go and sign the petition in support of Gabbard's bill. And that petition automatically emails the petition, signed petition, your copy of it, to 60 members of Congress who are on the Intelligence Committee and Foreign Affairs Committee. So it would be very helpful if you would take a minute and go on that site, hr608.info, and sign the petition. Go to members of Congress who are considering the bill. We are certain that in those committees the bill is going to be silenced and kept there on the table, because we want them to vote yes on it. So it would help. Thanks.
Would you have something to add to that, Tara?
Not to that in particular, but I will say that Veterans for Peace definitely supports that bill, and we support Tulsi, what she's calling for. And she's a lone wolf out there. You know, so
she's also a veteran.
What?
She's also
a veteran.
Of Iraq.
Yeah. I mean, we're not in total agreement with her on everything, but on these points we are in agreement. I did get the paper for another reason. But I want to thank you guys for your presentation. It was really, you added so much information, it was so important. I did want to say about the anti-war movement in particular, about building it and unifying it. One of the reasons that Veterans for Peace, and I think we've all realized this, that the anti-war movement specifically in the States has dwindled is because there's so many other issues that people are struggling with. People are struggling with the oppression against black people, against immigrants, the environmental destruction that's going on, the pipeline. So there's all these different issues. Well, what Veterans for Peace is doing and what a number of people are doing is connecting it, because we see that what's going on here, the violence, and this is all of this is violence. The violence that has been in this country since the inception of the country, right? With the genocidal war on Native Americans, is now exported. It doesn't come from nowhere. If I'm not a violent person, I'm not going to walk out of my house and be violent. If I'm violent inside, I'm going to be violent outside. So we see that it's all connected. So what we're trying to do now is to make these connections very, very prominent, to show how that there is no global warming without the might of the military, without the backup of armed and militarized police, National Guard, etc., private contractors who use violence. There's no such thing as, you couldn't have that. You couldn't have the oppression in the black community without militarized police, without these things. So everything comes back and is connected to this massive organized violence, which we call U.S. military, and all the effects that it has, all the weaponry. So I got the paper because we have 10, we came up with 10 demands. We just had a big rally in Washington, D.C., then a march to the White House, then more at the White House. And we had 10 demands, which, you know, Veterans for Peace is an anti-war organization. I mean, our principle is end war, because we think the war period is bad. But we realized some years ago that war is not just what's going on in Vietnam or what's going on in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria. That's not the only definition of war. Black people know war. Immigrants know war. Refugees know war. I mean, these are all aspects of war, organized violence. So we want people to get it, that these things are all connected. Then we can come together, then we can have a powerful movement, and this is part of it. You know, the Hands Off Syria is definitely a part of it, and I totally agree with this program. I'm just going to take one more second I wrote these, most of these demands with a little bit of help, but they're in the paper. And I want you to just think about for a minute how all of this is connected to this. It's connected, directly connected. So our first demand was, and you'll love this, dismantle the U.S. empire at home and abroad, because we are an occupied country. You know, we think, well, we walk around, we have freedom. No, not really. Freedom is having a say in what your community is doing, and we don't have that. You know, so that's number one. Number two is close all U.S. bases on foreign soil, bring the troops home. That would go a long way to alleviating all these problems. 3, ban nuclear weapons. 4, redirect the Pentagon budget, money for education, healthcare, infrastructure, and sustainable green energy, the environment. 5, dismantle corporate control of our government. We see how the corporations are totally interfaced with the military. Totally. 6, dismantle the school-to-prison military pipeline. 7, stop persecution of migrants, immigrants, and refugees. 8, end sexism and gender discrimination in the military. 9, respect and honor First Nations sovereignty and treaties. 10, end racism and racist violence. So all of those things connect with people that are struggling for what we were calling other issues. There's not any more other issues. They're all the same issue. They're all connected, and they're connected with this. And if we can connect with people on that level, then I think we're going to build a stronger anti-war and anti-imperialist movement, because that's what we're dealing with.
Can we go into a general discussion rather than keep on going? So hang on for 1 second. So let me just say also that Jerry Condon from Veterans for Peace is on the coordinating committee of Hands Off Syria. And also I want to just put in a plug for the UNAC conference, which is called End the Wars at Home and Abroad. And that's basically the same program which Derek just laid out. And I also want to mention that I have a list here. If you want to get your email on the email list for Hands Off Syria Coalition, please come up and give me your email. So this is an issue, Syria, that has divided the left, divided the anti-war movement. It's been a very powerful discussion in some sense. You heard what people said here. We will be accused, and Hands Off Syria Coalition is continually being accused as being pro-Assad. That is what we get accused of. You heard what we have said here, that our focus and the title of this is U.S. intervention, and leaving the aspect of what government people have to the people in that country. That's called self-determination. We support the right of self-determination. So this has engendered a lot of discussion. Let's see where it goes from here. If you have a question or discussion, please raise your hand. I'll call on you, let folks call on a bunch, get a bunch of questions and discussion, and then we'll let the folks on the panel answer. I see one person here, 2 and 3. Let's start with that. And then 4 back there.
I'm just curious, you always hear about, American interests. They always say it's about American interests. What exactly are the American interests? Corporate interests or globalization?
Yeah, okay.
Curious.
I'm sorry, this man here was next.
Yeah, I have an important question, please. Why is it very much, like Sarah pointed out, I can relate how Syria, and this is a fact that was beautiful before 2011, before the Zionist-backed rebels came in and wreaked havoc over there and killed millions of people. Why is it that the Muslim organizations, or so-called Muslim organizations, seem to support those rebels who have wreaked havoc over there? Of course, I know why the Jewish, or so-called Jewish, Israel lobby supports it, but the Muslim organization, just like I'm an anti-Zionist Jew, I'm called the self-hating Jew, but these folks aren't called self-hating Muslims. I get just like AIPAC doesn't speak for Jews, so to the Muslim organizations and Saudi Arabia don't speak for Muslims. Does someone elaborate on that?
Okay. Now, I feel one of you was the next person. Yes.
Yeah. Just to address the issue, it's not as much a question as of the takeover of Amnesty International and the brainwashing of what used to be potentially anti-war groups that have now been co-opted, basically. One of my issues is cultural, and I think it goes way back to the end of World War II. And it's a very specific objective of the U.S. to take over all forms of thought, including culture, and that it's been done. They've taken over the arts. They've denuded the thinking. I don't think we have an anti-war movement. I remember the anti-war movement from the 60s and 70s. It disappeared. Not completely, but so that's an issue for me, is the invasion of the body snatchers kind of issue with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and people. Nobody talks about the wars. I don't hear people. Bernie Sanders talks about free education and health care, but he never linked it up.
Right.
So anyway, I think it goes back to World War II, the end of World War II, and the purposeful objective of taking over all forms of thinking culturally.
Thank you. The man in back there.
Yeah, thank you
First
for all the
round.
panelists. I just have one comment. About 2 years ago, New York City was host to a photography exhibit in Chelsea. There was a photography exhibit called Ukraine, Syria, What's Next. I don't know if anyone got to see that, but it showcased before and after scenes of cities like Damascus, like Aleppo, and you could really see how secular the society was. So I think that was very important for those who visited, and it brought a lot of awareness. So I want to know how can we support those type of projects, because for the American public at large, it's so hard to get footage from the ground, to get reporting from the ground. We have to see RT, Al Jazeera, Telesur, aside from also joining your organizations and signing petitions, but how do we get the American public at large to support these projects and just bring greater awareness to the theme of imperialism that Gaman mentioned, which is so important and critical in this issue.
Thank you. Why don't we just go down the line and answer whatever you want to from the whole take that people gave, and we'll do a second round after that.
Can you reiterate the questions real quick, because I think you
All
wrote
right,
them down.
the first one was, what are U.S. interests? That we always hear U.S. interests in this region or this region. And the second one was why do, I don't know if I got down everything, but points that stuck out to me as
Yes,
people
yes.
said, why do so many Muslim organizations seem to support the rebels? And the third one is about changing the consciousness and intervening into the consciousness of people through Amnesty International, the Human Rights Watch, the arts, etc. And the third question was basically a statement about an exhibit that took place on Syria and Ukraine and other places showing the secularness of these cities before and how can we get involved in more projects like that.
And maybe each of us could keep our comments to less than 5 minutes, if you would time us.
I will time
So we
you.
have time for a second round of
Okay.
questions and comments.
Okay, go on.
Anybody who wants to go first, or you want to go in order?
Just go down the line and,
But we'll go down the line this way, then we'll go down the line that way.
Okay.
okay.
Okay, we're going to be duplicating each other, I suppose.
Well,
Maybe we can try not to.
In terms of what are our national interests, well, what they present as our national interests are not the same things as our real national interests. So they try to present their interests as the national interests, as they